Hello and welcome to the final part of my lecture. Well done for getting this far. I'll try and wrap this up fairly quickly now, so I'm aware I've been talking for quite a long time. Okay, so let's move on to talk about deficits in timing. And again, what I'm going to say here applies to any research area, not just time perception. There's an increasing trend to argue that certain disorders are due to deficits in timing. So, for example, autism, ADHD, Parkinson's disease, schizophrenia, etc., etc. Or to say that in aging we see deficits in timing. And there's a lot of woolly thinking involved here, and some of it is a consequence, I think, of the pressure for grant income, essentially. And one of the kind of strategies for getting grant income, sad to say, is to find yourself a clinical condition and try and link your research area to that clinical condition. So there's often sort of built-in motivation for people to see deficits when there may not be deficits. Let's have a look at a couple of examples. We're going to look at autism and Parkinson's disease. I'm not going to go into great detail here. It's the big picture here that's important. There's some evidence, or people want to argue that there's some evidence that deficits in timing underlie characteristics of autism. Already that proposition is problematic. First of all, when people say timing, there are a myriad of different behaviours and different cognitive processes or skills or ways of thinking that involve thinking about time. So it's not just enough to say that there are deficits in timing. You need to be specific about what type of timing you are talking about. You then also have the issue of classing all of these people under the umbrella of autism, which you probably know is problematic in itself. But I'm not going to go into that into detail. That's not what this part of the course is about. So you have the problem of what type of timing they're talking about. Secondly, what you might call purity. Okay, let's say they do have problems with some areas of timing. Well, is it a unique thing? Is it that they have a specific problem with timing, or is it that if I throw them a whole load of different perceptual tasks, that I'll find that they have problems with several of them, not just timing? So what I might be picking up is, I don't know, problems with attention or problems with following instructions as they're given to them. There could be many things which would end up with that group not performing as well as controls, but it might not be that it's anything specific to do with timing. Secondly, let's say it's true and they have a deficit of some particular type of timing. Well, so what? Does that actually produce or have anything to do, or is it a cause of any of their characteristics of autism? Or is it just a comorbidity? It's just something else that they have a problem with, but it doesn't actually cause or doesn't underlie any of the characteristics of autism. There are some real slippery slopes here, which you need to be careful of. So as I say, there are many different types of timing. The one I've talked about so far is what we call interval timing, or the perception of duration. We also have temporal order judgments and temporal synchronicity, so being able to tell which event came first, or being able to decide whether two events happened at the same time or not at the same time. We have temporal planning and diachronic thinking, which I'll talk about in a moment because they might not be as obvious to you, and motor timing. And recently we did a big systematic review of all of the studies in autism, and we broke them down into these different types of timing. And we found there was very little or very inconsistent evidence that people with autism have fundamental deficits with timing, particularly the perception of duration. What is true is if you interview people with autism or parents of people with autism, they will report having problems with time. But these tend to be more higher order things about thinking about time or where you are in time, or anticipating events happening at a certain time, or understanding if an event's going to happen in 15 minutes, what that means, having a feeling of how close or how far away 15 minutes is. So there are, and some of these are quite profound. We did a survey of, as part of the grant I've got at the moment, we did a survey of parents of school children who had autism, and we also had a control. And it was quite striking how often they mentioned problems to do with time, or getting ready for school in time, or being allotted certain amounts of time to, say, play on a computer game, and understanding 30 minutes time you need to stop playing the computer game and go to bed. So that we're not underplaying the problem here. There does seem to be a problem about time, but you need to be very careful about what type of timing it is. In our current grant, we've had a massive cohort of people with autism, and we've given them a whole battery of different tests to test all these different types of timing. So perception of duration, interval timing, you've already seen. That's the perception of duration. So just these beeps, tell me which one is longer, or identify a duration that you've heard before. And as you've seen, if we do that type of timing, then we can use computer modelling, and we can find out that if there is a difference between the autism group and the control group, then we can say something a bit more about why there might be a difference, whether it's difference in memory, variability or distortion, or differences in the way they're making their decisions or their threshold values. What we can't do, and this is again a common thing that people want to argue often that people with autism or people with schizophrenia or elderly people have a slowed down internal clock, or a clock that's running at a different rate to NTs or normals. But this is impossible to demonstrate. Between subject group speed differences are almost impossible to demonstrate. There may be ways around it, which I'm not going to get into today. But lots of people would like to argue that Group X have a faster or slower internal clock than Group Y. If you're interested in the details of this, you can read this paper by myself and John Weirden where we set all this out in detail. But if I show you a simple example, you'll see what the problem is here. So if we give people a pair comparison task, okay, give people a 400 millisecond tone, an 800 millisecond tone, and we ask them which is longer, and let's assume that our hypothesis is true. Let's say in one group, Group A, they have a fast clock that's ticking away at 2 ticks per millisecond. Well, for these two tones, they'll accumulate 800 ticks and 1600 ticks. So if I ask them which is long, they'll say that the 800 millisecond one is longer. If I ask them how much longer, they'll say it's about twice as long. Now let's repeat this with our experimental group, whether it's elderly people, people with autism or whatever. Let's assume that the hypothesis is true, that their internal clock is slowed down, so they're running at half the speed. I give them exactly the same stimuli, and you can see what's going to happen here. They accumulate half the amount of ticks that the fast group does, but relatively it's the same. So they accumulate 400 ticks and 800 ticks. They'll be able to tell me that the 800 millisecond tone is longer, and if I ask them how much longer, they'll say it's twice as long. So if I set up the experiment in this way, even if it's true that there's a difference in clock speed, it won't become apparent in the experiment. Now, the solution for this in some other cases, so if we're investigating clicks versus silence or some kind of drug manipulation, then there is a way around this. We can use what's called a state change paradigm. So here we get them to experience, learn, or remember the 400 milliseconds duration under one state, say with a slow clock, so they accumulate 200 ticks, and then we test or get them to experience the 800 millisecond tone under a different state. Okay, so either under the with the clicks or under the influence of the drug. And this time we will see a difference. If we compare this condition to one where there's no state change, then they'll identify it as being, say, still identify the 800 millisecond tone as being longer, but this time it won't be twice as long. It might be, say, 8 times as long. So there are ways around it, but obviously this is impossible for when you're looking at between groups. I can't get someone to experience one duration with autism and experience the other duration without autism. It just doesn't work that way. And it's the same with age. I can't get you to experience one duration as a young person and then wait 40 years and show you another duration and ask you to compare it to that previous one. It just doesn't work this way. These two are the types of timing: temporal planning and diachronic thinking. So temporal planning is quite different. Temporal planning is quite different to the lower order or more fundamental perceptual things to do with timing. These are ways in which people think about time. whether they consider future consequences of actions, or whether they reflect back on the past, or whether they refer to a clock or a watch in planning how much time he or she has left to do something. And there are parental time questionnaires for assessing this kind of thing. There's also something called diachronic thinking, and again, this is more kind of meta thinking about time. So it's understanding about events expanding through time, or things changing over time. So for example, planting a seed and watching it grow into a plant, and then watching it flower. The idea that events extend over time, and there are different orders for things, or different parts of the day. There are also other errors that people make when they try to attribute a particular disorder to some underlying problem with timing. A crass example of this is some people would make the argument that children with ADHD have disorders of perceiving duration. That's why they get incredibly impatient about something and throw a tantrum. Okay, I'm caricaturing here, but you get the idea. But this is a false attribution. Okay, if I give you another example, you'll see how absurd this is. So, for example, let's say I showed a small child a piece of paper that was red. Okay, and when I show them the red piece of paper, they go absolutely crazy. Okay, they throw a tantrum fit. Now, would I assume then would I make the conclusion that that child has a problem with colour perception? Probably not. Okay, it's the way they're reacting to that stimulus, not that they have some deficit in perceiving it. There are also you'll come across arguments from assumption. Okay, again, autism is an example. Parkinson's, we'll see in a moment, is another example where the assumption has already been made that you should find the deficit. People say, well, yes, it's well known that people with autism have problems with timing, even though they don't say what type of timing. It's well known that people with Parkinson's disease have problems with timing. So if you don't find it in your study, you'll come across weird arguments. So people say, well, that's because your Parkinson's disease patients weren't sick enough. Okay, they're arguing from the point of assumption, even though there isn't enough evidence to make that assumption in the first place. Other problems you may have, let's take Parkinson's as an example, then it's likely that those people will be on some form of medication. So do you test them on the medication? Do you test them off the medication? If you test them off the medication, then there are ethical issues about how long you can ask them to not take their medication for, and there are issues about how long it takes that medication to wear off. So there are non-trivial problems with this kind of thing. Parkinson's disease is exactly the same, arguments from presumption. So for a long time it was thought that Parkinson's disease patients had problems with timing. But John Weirden, my old PhD supervisor, did a whole battery of tests on people with Parkinson's disease and found that once you removed any kind of motor component, the size of the deficit, if it exists, is absolutely tiny compared to the progression of the disease. The other thing you'll find in patient studies is people using very strange timing tasks. So you have somebody who has access to a patient group, has expertise in that patient group, but they're not an expert or don't have any theoretical background in time perception or whatever the thing is they're investigating. So, and this can get quite annoying. So they'll quite often they'll make up some really weird timing task rather than doing what I've suggested that you should do throughout this lecture, which is go and find a standard psychophysical task. And they'll often be ignorant of the timing literature and theories. So even when they get the data out of the study, it's kind of useless because it doesn't fit into any theoretical model, or we can't compare it to the whole of timing literature where we have data on hundreds of studies of people of what normal timing data should look like. And you have this causal problem as well. So let's say it's true that Parkinson's disease or whatever the disorder is, that they have a deficit in timing function. Well, is it the case that deficit in timing is a cause of a characteristic of the disorder, or is the characteristic of the disorder causing deficit in time function? There are webs that need to be untangled in this, and there's a lot of woolly thinking about these kinds of issues. Okay, and some of what I've just said about patient studies also applies to imaging studies. So I'm quickly going to talk about some of the pitfalls and pratfalls. Pitfalls and pratfalls, yeah. So classic errors, again, using a non-standard behavioural task. Often this is a consequence of land grabbing. Again, same problem with we see with patient studies. So someone has access to the big shiny whiz-bang equipment, whether it's an fMRI machine or TMS, and they want to justify this expensive piece of equipment. So they'll start looking for things to investigate. Let's investigate time perception. But they use some non-standard behavioural tasks, so you don't know what the data should look like. This is probably the easiest way to get your paper rejected. How do you avoid this? Well, as I've been saying, stick to a standard psychophysical task, or even better, collaborate with an expert in the behavioural field that you're interested in. Okay? So if you're interested in doing something on imaging on time perception, then find someone like me who isn't an expert in imaging, but does know about the theoretical background of time perception. Also, don't be led by other imaging studies. Just because some other imaging study has got away with getting something published with a non-standard task, that doesn't mean that you would be as lucky. And again, this applies to patient studies as well. Other classic things you see in papers, which will cause problems, in imaging papers, not reporting the behavioural data. Amazingly, I see this quite often, although thankfully it's becoming less of a problem, I think. People have cottoned onto this. So they show you all the wonderful imaging data, but they don't actually show you the results on the behavioural tasks that they gave them. And this is a problem. So if you've got an experimental group and a control group, then I don't know how they differ in terms of their data. So how do I interpret the imaging? And if they do differ, then how do they differ? It's not just enough that they're worse in one task than another. I want to do some computer modelling or something to find out what it is about their performance on that task that's producing that reduction in performance. There are also issues with task difficulty. So obviously in imaging you're going to have some kind of control task. Well, I want to know whether the control task shows the same level of difficulty as the experimental task that I'm interested in. So you might control for all of the things that are going on in that experimental task, but you also need to control for task difficulty. And you'll be able to look, if you've got the behavioural data, you can see whether that's true or not, whether you control properly or not, or whether the control task is far easier or far more difficult. And also, did they even understand the task? Are they performing on the task in a sensible way that shows that they understood the task and they understood the instructions and that it wasn't just too difficult for them and they're just responding at random? So easy ways to avoid this: report the behavioural data, give a graph, show them the data. Remember that statistics are not the data. Statistics are simply an interpretation of the data, just like computer modelling is an interpretation of the data. So show them the data, give descriptives. The data is a thing that you've gone to the trouble of collecting. It's what people are most interested in. Your interpretation of that data, that might be something that comes under scrutiny or might change over coming years. But the data is the important stuff. And use modelling if it's available. So yeah, my sort of take-home grumble message there, if you get involved in imaging studies, pay as much, if not more, attention to the nature of the behavioural task and the control. Otherwise, the imaging data is meaningless. Okay, so going back to these diagrams, if you set things up properly, so you control the cognitive element, your behavioural task, your stimulus, and get the data out and analyse it correctly, and you have your imaging set up correctly, then what you should have is this perfect scenario where you're getting both the behavioural data out of the black box and you're getting the image of activation out of the black box. Then you really do have a powerful paradigm. But if you don't get both of these things sorted out, then it's not going to be anywhere near as powerful. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about, and this will just take a couple of minutes, I'm reaching the end here, is often in psychology, and again when we're talking about biological models or imaging or neuroscience, there's often a false debate that goes on in psychology. It's worth thinking about. So with the advent of neuroscience, in the attempt to make psychology more scientific, and there's a whole debate to be had in that, there's often been a dismissal of functional or cognitive models, that the idea that biological models are somehow superior. And really this is a false debate, it's a false way of thinking. They're both essential, they're both different levels of explanation. And my old PhD supervisor used to use this analogy as a way of thinking about this. He said it was useful to think of the God question. So, putting aside whether you believe in God or not, let's suppose for the moment this all-knowing being exists, and you get to meet him. You get to meet him, and you get to ask him a question about your research field. Okay, so I might meet God and say, look, human beings are really, really good at discriminating the duration of events. How is this done? And God says, well, it's like this, my son. And he starts reeling off this really complicated explanation. He starts talking about glial cells and calcium ion channels and diffusion and different pathways and striatal loops and the involvement of the thalamus and all of this information. And he goes on and on. At some point, you might go, okay, whoa, okay. Can you give me an overview? Can you give me a metaphor of this? And God might say, well, okay. It's as if people have an internal clock. There's something in the brain that functions very similar to a pacemaker, and there's something that functions very similar to a switch. And there's an accumulator which counts or accumulates the amount of pulses. And you might say, oh, okay, that's fine. That kind of explanation is okay for me. And God might say, yeah, and also we have good mathematical descriptions about how different parts of this system function, the computation that they perform. And that might be okay to you. But for other people, it might not be. They might be saying, well, actually, tell me more about the calcium ions. Okay? So it's different levels of explanation. Even if we have the most sophisticated biological model that could ever be, we will always need some level of abstraction, some functional or cognitive level of abstraction. The other famous quote, I can't quite remember who said this now, is that, well, all models are wrong, but some of them are useful. Okay, I'm going to end there. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you for listening to me. I'm sorry I can't be physically in your presence in the lecture room. Hopefully I'll get to see you at some point this academic year. And that's it for now. Thank you.